I'm Carla Reeves, and this is Differently, a podcast where we explore the ins and outs of what becomes possible when we're willing to think, do, and show up differently to the moments of our everyday lives. For years of my life, I felt like I didn't fit. I felt like I was on the outside looking in, but I created a well-polished life that looked good on the outside. But inside, I felt bland, boring, uninspiring, and empty because I was so busy trying to be something others would approve of. I didn't know who I really was. I worked hard in my life to break down the facade, to create a more authentic life. And then I discovered I had ideas and things on my heart that I felt called to share. And this felt terrifying to someone who'd spent most of her life trying to conform and fit in. The book, The Art of Being Unmistakable, showed up in my life about this time, kind of earlier on in my developing my own business and sharing my ideas. And reading this book was liberating to me. It inspired me to start breaking my own rules, to follow and trust the God-given compass I knew I had, and helped me to start showing up, to write, to speak, to lead, or whatever it was, in the face of feeling afraid for the sake of something much bigger than me. Today, I have the honor and privilege of having the author of that book here with me. Maybe you know him. Meet Srinivas Rao. He's the host and founder of the Unmistakable Creative podcast, where he's interviewed more than 1,000 people, from bank robbers to billionaires. He's a keynote speaker on the topics of innovation, creativity, and productivity. He's kind of a big deal. What I love about Srini is that he's a normal, really approachable guy who loves to surf and snowboard and talk about cool subjects that will inspire and fuel your life. I'm so excited for you to meet him. Here we go. Hey, Srini, welcome to Differently.
Hey, Carla, it's nice to connect with you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I am so excited to have you here. I don't know if you know this, but well, I know you don't know this, is that when I sat down one day and thought, who out of my immediate world would I want to have on this podcast? And your name is one of the first names that showed up on that list. And you are someone who has inspired me for a really long time. I know you and I connected in your writing workshop, and I got to know you a little bit there, but your work was inspiring me long before that. And I want to tell you a little story about that, but I would love for you
Sure.
I'm so excited to share you with my listeners in case they don't know who you are, but just give us a sense of who you are and kind of what you're up to.
Yeah. All right. Well, because I want to keep this focused on value for your listeners, I'll try to keep that part short and sweet. But I'm the host of the Unmistakable Creative podcast. I started podcast long before it was cool to do so. I think we started in 2009. But the thing is, a lot of people don't know that because there was a predecessor to what is now Unmistakable Creative called Blogcast FM, where I interviewed bloggers. And that's how it just started. It was by accident. My friend Sid Savar, it's ironic that you mentioned that, the reason you know me well is because of the writing workshop. The irony is that the reason I started a podcast was because my original co-founder, Sid Savar, said I was an average writer, which I don't disagree with him. I still think he's right. I am a far better interviewer than I am a writer. And the numbers speak for themselves. Like, far more people listen to the Unmistakable Creative than have probably ever read my books or even read my writing. But yeah, so that, honestly, it was just really a fortunate accident to be 10 years ahead of what has now become a massive cultural trend. And during that time, the inevitable byproduct of talking to thousands of just bizarre out there creatives and from every walk of life, ranging from bank robbers to drug dealers to porn stars, is that you pick up a lot of, tidbits here and there. And so I've had all these other sort of offshoot creative projects, like planning events. I do, some public speaking, although I didn't do very much during COVID. I created a note-taking course for people who want to do knowledge management, mainly because I needed it, because I think that the sheer volume of information that I have to synthesize and organize is significantly higher than the average person's, because I read the book of every single person I interview. Then I probably read another book a week just for my own interest. And then between that, writing and everything else, I needed to create systems for all this. So that's the short version.
Yeah, there are so many things I want to dive into, but you were doing podcasting long before it was cool. I was thinking about that. You've been doing that for a really long time. And speaking of your books, like that's how I was first introduced to you. I will not ever forget the day my husband called me into the room and was like, you gotta listen to this guy. You're going to love this guy. And you were on Glenn Beck's show. And I don't even remember what you said on that episode, but I immediately bought your Art of Being Unmistakable book. Actually, it wasn't even a book, right? It was, I don't even remember how I got it.
The $2.99. It was a $2.99 Kindle book. And I remember thinking to myself, if this thing sells 300 copies, I will be satisfied. And the irony of that was that the reason I wrote that book was because I gave up on getting a book deal. And I was like, all right, this is never going to happen for me. So I'm just going to self-publish. And the strange thing about that was 2 years after I published it, it led to a book deal with a publisher. Courtesy of Glenn Beck, it became a Wall Street Journal bestseller. And apparently, you can't make the New York Times bestseller list if you're a self-published author, or some old white guy sitting in a room doesn't think that you're good enough for the list.
Well, I immediately got that book. I still go back to that book. I devoured it in like a couple hours, and I have gone back to it again and again, and it continues to be a reminder for me to be myself, to do the work I'm here to do, that's on my heart to do in this world, and to show up and write even when I don't have anything to say, but that has far more to do with life than it does writing, even though I do love to write. But you are that reminder to me. And that book, I want to share a couple snippets from that book, but I'm curious. That book had a huge impact on my life, as I'm sure it did many others. I've recommended it to clients for years and years, and I'm curious what role that book played in your life.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny because I barely remember that book at this point. And it's funny, every now and then I'll see people pull up quotes on Instagram, and I'm like, I wrote that? I was like, okay, that sounds... and it's funny because that book, Seth Godin had a really interesting way of phrasing this when I was asking him about Julian Smith, when Julian wrote The Flinch for the Domino Project. And he said, Julian came in as a ruckus maker, and he evolved into a writer. And I would say that that book was my ruckus making, piece. Whereas the funny thing is, my traditionally published books are far more well written, but they conform to the sort of format of what a publisher expects. And the thing about Art of Being Unmistakable, I remember even when my editor acquired it at Penguin, she said, I want to talk to you about the structure. And she said, there isn't one. I said, I'm aware of that. It was literally just a bunch of Facebook status updates, compiled into a book. But the way the status updates were resonating, I kind of thought, okay, this might be interesting. Let me, do this as an experiment. It almost looked literally, that's all it was. It was like, I have something to say. I'm going to package it in a book. I'm going to make it available. And Glenn Beck, finding that thing was really serendipitous. And honestly, I think if Justine hadn't written the foreword, Justine Musk, he probably wouldn't have kept reading. Because my joke is the only downside of having somebody like Justine Musk write the foreword of your book is that the book sucks in comparison to the foreword, because she's such an eloquent writer, much more than I was at the time. And so to say that book didn't change my life would be ridiculous, because it led to a book deal with a publisher. I ended up writing 2 books. I sold 15,000 copies. But the weird thing is that, funny enough, like I forget at times, it's like, oh, right, I'm a Wall Street Journal bestselling author, but I don't feel like a Wall Street Journal bestselling author, because what happens is you end up, changing the goalpost every time you accomplish one goal. Then the goalpost keeps changing. So, you go into Penguin Portfolio where it's like, oh, now my peers are Seth Godin, Ryan Holiday, and Simon Sinek. I'm like, great, I'm the redheaded stepchild of Penguin Portfolio. But I think that's fitting in a lot of ways, given the brand. I mean, I think that, really I think that was my first time to just be irreverent and opinionated. And, just be like, unapologetically myself in what I said in that book. And that I think is one thing that I realized just looking at this. If I were looking at sort of what are the foundations of emotionally resonant content, right? Emotionally resonant content, they're, sort of purpose and mission, a point of view, and then a problem that you solve for somebody. Now, I have no idea what problems that book solved for people, but I think the point of view thing was really big, and I didn't express my opinions as explicitly prior to that. And my friend Erica Learmark told me this. She said, when I talk to you offline, when you're not in front of an audience, you're incredibly opinionated, and you're willing to piss people off. And she said that needs to show in your writing. And now it has. Like, I'm pretty unapologetic. If you hear our, latest segments, so people have referred to Unmistakable Creative, the interview-based segment, as TED Talks meets Oprah. I would say that our new segment, the Creativity Hour, is more like TED Talks meets Howard Stern. It's kind of irreverent, we're inappropriate, and it's my best friend. So, and it's interesting because I think the audience is finally getting to hear from me for the first time, because I really have pretty much just hid behind other people's stories. Like, that's what I built a brand off of, telling other people's stories, and so that book really, in a lot of ways, I would say that book helped me discover what my actual purpose and message were. It helped me discover my point of view, is really what it comes down to.
Well, I think that, like when I think of that book, like for me, the way in which it was written, that it wasn't perfect, was perfect, because it actually, that book for me helped me to like continue or more powerfully let go of the constructs and the ways that I had been trying to conform and put myself in a box and appear to others the way I thought I should appear, and on and on and on, right? So it really helped me like push down those walls and barriers of conformity to figure out who am I really? And so it sounds like it was a breaking through for you, or a breaking free for you. And it was that for me too.
Yeah. I mean, the central ethos of our brand is kind of, standing out in a sea of noise. And, Terry Gentile Terry McMullen told me once that, there's great creative potential in the things that make you angry. And what made me angry was that every time I would come across projects on the internet, I'm like, why is it there's so many people who create this derivative work where they look at what works for somebody else and then, they try to mimic it. And I'm like, okay, I've just finished writing this blog post titled "You Can't Copy and Paste Someone Else's Path to Success," but that's what people try to do. And then they're like, why doesn't this work? And I'm like, go look in the mirror. That's why it doesn't work. Because prescriptive advice, I've learned, is a framework. It's not a formula. And I wouldn't say I've become more cynical, but I've become more skeptical about the information that I consume. Like I think we finished our episode of the Creativity Hour on Wednesday saying, I want to finish this up by telling you to consider the possibility that everything I'm telling you is bullshit, which I would say to your listeners as well, because everything that everybody says is bullshit to varying degrees for different people based on the context of their life. So that's why I think that prescriptive advice, unfortunately, is packaged as these sort of universal formulas for success and meaningless platitudes that we mistake for business strategies. And the problem with people who write books in general is we leave out a lot that happens in between. Like, we might mention, failures and, small things here and there, but pretty much you leave out the entire journey and you're like, here's the big, like, low points and high points, and here's the lessons I learned. And, this is how, you can be inspired by this, but we don't tell the truth, entirely, partially because we're public figures. We have to do, some filtering. But that's the thing. There's just so many parts of people's stories that are left out. And I think that content creators, marketers, influencers are notorious for ignoring context in the way they present what they do, as well as, consumers consuming content ignore context in their lives. They're like, oh, this person says everybody should start a podcast, and say, well, wait, this person who's telling you this has 100,000 subscribers on their email list, and they had that when they started the podcast. Of course, their podcast was successful. It's convenient that they would leave that off of a sales page, and then everybody's shocked that they're not getting the same results. And it's like, well, one, you're not that person. Two, it's a different context. And three, why the hell would you want to replicate the same thing that the instructor created?
Yeah. So how does that show up in your work and life today for you?
Well, I think that the place where it probably shows up the most is in how I choose podcast guests. And I mean, you know this, you've listened for a long time. The thing that we're known for is that you will find people that you have never found on another podcast on Unmistakable Creative. And that's by design. I also turn down really, really famous people. At this point, you know, I've said it on our show, I've turned down Gary Vaynerchuk 3 times. And people think that's insane because, like, you know, that having Gary Vaynerchuk would increase your downloads. And I'm like, yeah, I don't give a shit about increasing downloads. I care about providing value for my listeners.
Mm.
And sometimes that will come at the cost of my metrics. And so I've always made it a point never to let metrics determine editorial policy. And yeah, my friend was just asking me on the ski lift today. He said, you know, if you taught a podcast course, aren't you worried that like one of your students would, you know, become a competitor? I was like, no, because there's no way they can compete with me because I choose every single guest based on personal curiosity. So unless they somehow have extracted my brain from my head, that's impossible. So that I think is where it really shows up, is that I don't actually, you know, do what other people do. And I have probably the most ruthless standards for podcast guests. Like I cut interviews in the middle if I don't like how they're going. I say no to people that everybody says yes to, and I say yes to people nobody has ever heard of. It's the thing is, I mean, and I think that was reflected in one of our iTunes reviews. Somebody said that, you know, I love, you know, having, you know, my favorites, but it sometimes starts to sound like you're hearing the same people on every podcast. And my favorite thing about Unmistakable is that I always discover new people. And that's by design, because one of the things I learned from Robert Greene early on when we were talking about mastery was he said, you know, the analogy is biodiversity. The more species that you have in an ecosystem, the richer that ecosystem is. And so that became my philosophy about how to choose guests. I thought, you know, the broader and wider range of people that I expose myself to, the more data points I'm going to have to create something original. Whereas if you're kind of just, you know, consuming the same things as everybody else, reading the same books, reading the same blogs, listening to the same podcasts, then you kind of get trapped in this echo chamber and you end up with this very myopic point of view. And so, you know, I don't always agree with things that, you know, my podcast guests say. And so I always tell people, even when I teach a course, I'm like, and it's something that I didn't really understand even when I taught the writing course. But now I do. I always have to preface everything I say by telling everybody to consider the possibility that what I am telling them is bullshit. Because, and I learned this from a friend when he said, I don't think you understand your audience. And then I had a woman named Michelle Florendo, who's been a podcast guest in one of my workshops. It was an audience building workshop. And, you know, I was talking about various strategies for productivity, and she would show up with a baby. And I'm like, wait a minute, I'm basing this advice on the context of being a single guy who doesn't have to change diapers in the morning, who doesn't have 2 toddlers screaming. I'm like, this advice is nonsense for her. You know, and so that's when I said, I was like, okay, Michelle, you've pretty much proved my point. You need to modify this advice so that it works for you. Don't take it as gospel. And that, I think, is one of the big problems that I see when you have these sort of highly influential people, is that people treat their word as gospel. And it's like, well, look, there's a lot of things that go into that you are not seeing. You see the pretty Instagram pictures and you're like, oh, if I light scented candles, I'll sell 1 million books. It's like, no, you idiot. You're not going to sell 1 million books by lighting scented candles. You're going to do that by sitting your ass in a chair and writing a book.
Yeah. So I'm curious about a couple things. One is this thread of Unmistakable, doing things differently, because I really respect that about you. When did that start for you? Like, when did you feel that? I'm imagining you were pretty young.
It was, well, so it's funny you say that, because I come from a culture of conformity and expectation, right? You know, Indian people you're raised with the expectation of high achievement. My roommate's like, were you a straight A student in high school? I was like, of course I was a straight A student in high school. And parents would have given us up for adoption if we didn't get straight A's. But here's the thing. You know, it takes a lot more than book smarts to succeed in the real world. And being a straight A student in high school doesn't mean you're smart. It means you're disciplined. Any moron can be a straight A student in high school. There's a reason that, you know, valedictorians don't become CEOs, because they're good at following instructions. And when you're the CEO of a company or you're doing something like this, you have to basically come up with the instructions yourself. Like, nobody tells you what to do. For me, this was actually honestly born out of necessity. So, yeah, I mean, you know, I've been fired from every job I've ever had. So, you know, literally, if I had a LinkedIn headline and I had to find a real job, the headline would be, I am basically, you know, somebody who's been fired from every job. And my resume is basically a rap sheet filled with, you know, the places that I've served time in corporate America. But funny enough, I went back in now with the knowledge base I have, I would be really good at what I do but I would either get fired on the first day or promoted by the end of the first week. And those are the extremes. And so part of it was born out of necessity. I mean, I was always kind of like this oddball kid in my family because I was this creative weirdo who didn't want to become a doctor, didn't want to follow sort of a prescribed path, mainly because it didn't work. That was, the one thing. It's like when you get to your parent, you're 30 years old and you're like, okay, I'm broke. I've had 2 degrees and I'm living at my parents' house. Clearly this, plan is not working. I need to do something different. And I wrote about this in the second book, Unmistakable, Why Only Is Better Than Best, where I said, when I looked at this, I looked back at 10 years, I was like, all right, if I want to be in a different place 10 years from now, then I have to make some seriously different choices. Otherwise, I'm going to just end up right back where I started. And so that was a big part of it. I mean, I didn't fit the mold for corporate America. I didn't fit the mold for a typical Indian person. I mean, I don't know if you saw my brief, stint on reality TV, which was ridiculous. But I think the reason I was there was because I didn't fit the model of what people expected of an Indian guy. I was like their token misfit. Even when they were casting, I was like, why do you want me? And they're like, well, we have a lot of doctors and engineers. I was like, shocking. You're doing a show about Indian people and you have doctors and engineers as your contestants. So that's the thing. It's kind of, you're like, I'm fighting cultural programming regularly. And that's still something I have to work on is, okay, how do I stop measuring myself against these expectations? Like my sister is like the most badass human being you'll ever meet. She, was the chief anesthesiology resident at Yale. She finished a fellowship at UCLA and she's like charming, charismatic, like likable. She's everything that I'm not. So like, she's naturally that way. I'm an acquired taste.
Well, and I love that you say like you're always solving your own problems, right? Like that has also become a thread of all of your work. Is that right? Like
yeah,
you create things to solve your own problems.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's, it's like, okay, I'm always looking for the least amount of effort and the most output that I could get, for the least amount of effort. So, basically optimizing for my laziness. And funny enough that turns out to be a really big advantage when you are, running a company, because there's only a handful of things I do well. In fact, there's probably one, maybe two, if that, maybe one. I interview people well. Beyond that, I'm pretty average at everything else. And when you start to realize that, you're like, okay, great. How do I optimize so that I can spend the bulk of my time doing the handful of things I'm good at and make other people do the things I suck at? So perfect example, Art of Being Unmistakable, that cover was really something that caught people's attention. And there's no way in hell I could have drawn that. And I remember I tried to teach myself how to draw. And you can, if anybody wants to, subject themselves to some really shitty art, go up to my Instagram feed and scroll 2 years back or 5 years back. I did this 30-day project where I taught myself how to draw. And at the end of 30 days, I was like, oh, wow, I'm not really good at drawing. And I didn't get all that much better. I mean, I improved. But what that opened up to me was the fact that I could collaborate with other people who could bring my visions to life. I was like, oh, I don't have to draw this stuff myself. I could tell people what I want somebody else to draw. And that kind of started this collaboration with Mars Dorian, who really honestly shaped the visual voice of Unmistakable. In fact, he deserves more credit for this concept than I do. I just took it and turned it into something much bigger. I mean, it was his words that literally, when we came with that idea, that led to that. And it's funny because if you look at the Art of Being Unmistakable book, this is one of the weird, oversights on my part in that book. When Penguin acquired the book, my editor, Stephanie, she said, you realize you never once defined what it means to be unmistakable, right? I was like, okay. But that's the thing, like in some ways that makes sense now, right? Because there is no one definition. That would be an oxymoron.
Yeah, because I feel like you did without doing it. You did without defining it, is how I feel. Like you helped me find that unmistakable part within me. You helped me search for that, look for that, appreciate that, right? Without actually defining it. I think that was almost the beauty of it. But kind of interesting.
Well, so this is something that I think is really fascinating. Right? So a lot of people hear about the work of people like Simon Sinek and a lot of these people who talk about, sort of finding that thread that defines your voice, people like Donald Miller, who've done probably some of the best work on really uncovering a person's story that is in existence. Like those guys are phenomenal at what they do. But the problem is that you have to create in order to discover what that message is. And often the purpose and the mission behind what you do reveals itself through the work that you do. So it took me 4 years to arrive at this thesis of unmistakable. It wasn't until 4 years of, just throwing things out there and seeing what stuck and then seeing what was resonating. And then bit by bit, I started to notice, I was like, oh, there are common threads here with the things that resonate. I was like, okay, I think I have something here. And those are in everybody's work, but they reveal themselves. You just have to pay attention to them. And that's the other problem. We're so caught up in just, creating the next thing and moving on to the next thing and going so fast that we don't stop and take the time to say, okay, well, let me reflect on this and, figure out what it is that's going on here, and what's resonating with people. Like, we are going so fast and we're so distracted and overwhelmed by information overload that is kind of a big problem. Like, we don't have the time and space that you need. Just as we were talking before we hit record, like, I've been on the mountain for 3.5 hours before I sat down to do any work this morning. I did write in the morning, but yeah. And so we need those sort of spaces of solitude and spaces for sort of deep reflective thinking that are often places where you're not going to connect with other people and, in fact, are completely unrelated to your actual work.
So incredibly true. So I heard you say, I think you said you're a high achiever or hyper achiever. I don't know, but I'm a hyper achiever as well. And for years, I didn't know how to relax. I didn't think I really needed to relax or wanted to relax, for that matter. I'm very happy doing. And I've had to learn over the years how to relax and how to play and how to step away, knowing that every time I do, it fuels all of my work. And I'm sure that you see that over and over again with your snowboarding.
I'd be lying to you if I told you that this wasn't a challenge for me, because, as Unmistakable has grown, we raised a round of investor money in 2019. It's a different ballgame. So suddenly you have this other expectation to live up to. And it's this really interesting balancing act of, okay, I have to have the same risk tolerance and daring that got me to where I'm at, while simultaneously considering the fact that now I'm accountable to a lot of other people. And that's one thing that a lot of people don't realize, is that when you're in the public eye, your actions have implications for other people. And, all you have to do is just turn on the news and watch any politician who basically says something stupid, and then, watch what, happens. The Will Smith fiasco is a perfect example of this, right? If you're Will Smith and you go up on stage and you slap Chris Rock, there are far greater implications to that than if I walk outside of the condo that I'm in right now, just slap some random stranger. I might get punched in the face, but that's not going to end up on every news channel.
Yeah. So how do you make that a priority?
Yeah, I wish I had some sort of set answer for you here. You were talking about scheduling this, and I told you, I try to reserve Mondays and Fridays for snowboarding. Yeah. And I try to make sure that I don't do more than one interview a day, because I found that the quality declines when I do anything back to back. You've heard my interviews. It takes work to produce that, because I go really deep with people. And I'm a terrible listener. And so I have to basically take the thing that I'm worst at and somehow I've made a career out of. And it's ironic. People will say that I'm a great listener when they hear me interview. And then you talk to my friends, that's amazing, because Srini sucks at listening. Literally, I've had, Carla, women who listen to Unmistakable Creative set me up on dates with friends, and then they get pissed off. They're like, my friend said you were a terrible listener. I can't believe that. And I'm like, you set your friend up on a date with a host of a podcast, not with me. And there's a difference. I think to some degree we all play a character in the public eye. But I think a lot of it comes down to having these physical activities. For me, it's pretty much extreme sports. I'm a complete adrenaline junkie. And I think when you're as, hyperactive as I am, you need a place to just let all that energy out. And the mountain or the ocean is a good place to do that. And also, nature is really humbling, because it just makes you realize how insignificant you are in the grand scheme of things. You're like, oh, mountains, oceans. You're like, wow, I'm like who was that? I think it was Carl Sagan. It was like, you're like a speck of dust on this planet. I don't remember the exact quote, but it just forces you to contemplate your own insignificance. And the other thing is, it forces you to be present. If you're going 30 miles an hour down a mountain, you really can't be thinking about much else.
That's right. You're forced to be present. Yeah. So I'm curious, do you still surf?
Not.
I know you live in Colorado.
Yeah, I haven't been in the water in 2 years. It's kind of
Mm,
I'm going back to California in May, and I definitely miss it. Like I still think about it. I mean, surfing has left sort of these imprints on my life. Unfortunately, snowboarding was a nice replacement.
for
But
sure.
yeah, that was definitely one of I mean, that's part of why I never left California. But I also realized what I was lacking was social connection, and I was getting really depressed while I was living there. I was like, okay, great, I can surf, but if I don't have close friends that I see regularly, I'm kind of losing out on something. And it was kind of like there's always going to be a trade-off, right? No matter what you do. Like I realized that every decision you make in life is a trade-off between freedom and security. So it's I basically had to trade off the freedom of surfing for the security of having a great group of friends.
Yeah. So there are so many places I still want to go, and I also want to be respectful of your time. But
That's fine.
what,
Keep talking.
um, what? So a couple things. One is this is a conversation that I have been having with clients about. A lot of times people talk about just feeling like an imposter and they want to get over that. And what I've experienced in my world is that that doesn't necessarily go away. And I'm curious, you had said when we were talking about your book, and you said, I don't feel like a Wall Street bestselling author. And I'm curious if you've seen that evolve or shift in your own world, or does it remain to just regardless of what level of success you create inside of your business?
Yeah, yeah. Look, everybody feels like a fraud. I mean, Seth Godin has said this in his own books. Imagine a guy who writes 17 New York Times bestselling books saying every day I feel like an imposter. Yeah, of course I feel like an imposter. And the thing is that you can either accept that that's the case and move on, or you can fight it and say, okay, I'm not going to say what I need to say until I gotten over this. And Carla, when I wrote Art of Being Unmistakable, I was 35 years old, living with my parents. Like nobody in that position should be giving anybody advice on how to be successful in any capacity. Like there's no credibility whatsoever to a person giving advice in that position. But literally, I had a guy who literally sent me a message on LinkedIn once saying maybe you should work on yourself before you try to help other people. And I was like, fuck you, and I blocked that guy on LinkedIn. And I realized I got something to say. I'm going to say it. And so I think that that's one thing we have to be aware of. And no, so of course, there's a caveat to this. This is the other thing. I always tell people if you were to try to reverse engineer my path and think that you were going to become successful, you'd be an idiot. Because literally the path is go get fired from every job you've ever had, live at your parents' house, start a blog, get lucky, have a editor at Penguin find your article on Medium and get a book deal. That is impossible to reverse, and you'd be a moron if you thought that that would work. So that's the caveat. I needed to make sure that we put that out there too. But again, look, everybody feels like a fraud at any time, and no matter what you accomplish, you're always going to feel like you haven't accomplished enough. Like I realize there's no point, I realize, where you will ever feel satisfied if you're a driven or ambitious person. And I think that that's healthy on some levels and unhealthy on others. It's like, okay, how do you find a sense of satisfaction and joy? So part of that is, focusing on process and less on outcomes. I think, to me, the part I hate most about writing books is being done, because then
Mm.
you have to do the part that sucks, which is, oh, let's see if anybody wants to buy this thing. The part that's fun is the actual writing. And you talk to most authors, they say that holding a finished book in your hand is probably one of the most empty feelings in the world, because it doesn't represent all the
Mm.
blood, sweat, and tears and countless hours that have gone into it. You just look at this and you're like, all right, I spent 2 years writing this thing, and people are going to spend 2 days reading it. So yeah, I think that my thought process around this has, like I said, evolved. I think that I'm not cynical per se, but more skeptical. And I had a roommate who is the ultimate optimist, and he and I are like yin and yang. And I think we're both very good for each other, because I call him on his bullshit, and he will tell me to think positive. And at this point, gut instinct is to look for why something will fail before I think about why it will succeed. And so I think that I remember writing about this. I said that there's the funny thing is that delusional optimists and cynics actually have a lot in common. They both, because delusional optimists expect the best, but they do nothing to bring it about. And cynics expect the worst, and they do nothing to bring it about. So believe it or not, cynics and delusional optimists have a lot in common. And I think there is a high level of delusional optimism, particularly in the sort of self-help, online prescriptive world, like where we sell people false hopes and, mythical dreams without giving them the reality of what's involved. Like every online course should put the disclaimer, this might not work for you,
That's so true.
because it might not. Like there's literally nothing that works for everybody. This is the thing I would say is like, if you ever read something on the internet that says, and the thing is, these kinds of things tend to go viral too. So I pick on my friend Ben Hardy, even though I've had him as a guest on the podcast. He wrote that post, 8 things that everybody should do before 8 a.m. And I think it's such a perfect example of where people don't consider context. So, he says, okay, like if you just spent 13 hours working at a hospital, there's literally nothing on that list that you should do. You should go to sleep, And so that's why context matters so much.
That's so true. So talk to me a little bit about being a creative. For years of my life, I told myself I wasn't creative, and I had a really good friend in my life that basically said, like, you're the business side and I'm the creative side. So that kind of reinforced that I wasn't creative. And so for years I had this dialogue that I wasn't creative. And I can't remember when I started. It was through writing. Through writing, I started realizing like there was a lot more inside of me, and that while creativity didn't look like, painting or drawing or the traditional way I thought of creativity, I actually don't know how I ever denied creativity, because it comes through everything I do in the way that I approach life. It just doesn't look like I once thought it had to look. And so I'm curious what that has meant for you in your life and how that has evolved.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, so what I really like about the way that the internet has evolved and the just sheer variety of projects that you see that are interesting is that we've broadened our definition of creativity. I think that when you limit this definition of creativity to what we think of as quote unquote traditional creatives, like, artists, writers, whatever, we actually don't realize that everybody is creative, right? And the only difference is that the people that you think of as creative are in the habit of expressing their creativity on a regular basis, and the people who don't think they're creative don't express their creativity. Now, there are numerous reasons for this, and I think school is largely to blame for most of this, because the school is a system based on standardization, and you can't, have a system with standardization and produce creative thinkers. Like basically creativity decreases in proportion to standardization, yet our entire education system is based on standardization. And paradoxically, employers of the future say that creativity is going to be one of the most important skills. Mm-hmm. So you've got sort of, this conundrum or whatever it is, where our schools are basically creating, sort of obedient factory workers, as Naval Ravikant said. They kill curiosity because, teachers, unfortunately, are forced to teach to a test. I think teachers are not to blame. I think anybody would tell you they've been who's been successful in any capacity have been the beneficiary of amazing teachers. I mean, to me, if I were to go back and tell you the teacher that made the biggest impact on where I'm at today was my high school band director in 9th grade. He took me under his wing. He taught me how to practice. He taught me about discipline. He taught me things that didn't come full circle until 20 years later, but I mean, he deserves far more credit than he'll ever get for where I'm at. And it's really sad because now we're, removing arts education from schools to prioritize, STEM and other stuff. And yet, Dan Pink had a really interesting way of talking about this. When I asked him about this, he said, people are becoming increasingly narrow specialists, but then you go out into the real world and you are required to solve multidisciplinary problems. So part of it is that we're just not in the habit of expressing our creativity. And we need to create the conditions for that. Like organizations, if you're looking at it at an organizational level, companies need to give employees permission, encouragement, and time and space to not only follow their curiosity, but express their creativity, regardless of what those outcomes are. But they don't do that. And, when you don't allow people to speak up, when you don't allow people to express themselves, they start to have a fear of authority. And then, fear of failing turns into fear of trying. And so as a result, you just get a bunch of yes men and yes women who just do what their boss says. And, it just goes all the way back to school of, hey, do what the teacher says and you'll get a good grade. but that's not how the real world works. It's like there are no real grades and there are no letter grades in the real world. And so that's a big part of it. It's one of those things that you just have to get in the habit of expressing. And you know what? You're going to suck when you start. Like, that's the other thing. People don't like being bad at things. And the thing that they don't realize is, well, when you're bad, nobody's paying attention anyway. So who gives a shit? Honestly, there's probably no time in the life of any creative person when they're going to have more freedom of expression than when they don't have an audience. And most people are so caught up in trying to build an audience that they don't realize that. Because that's the time when you can just kind of try the craziest, ballsiest, batshit, insane ideas. And sometimes those work, and that's one thing I think we need is a higher level of risk tolerance for creative ideas that fail. And it doesn't matter if they fail. I think that the key is to make sure these are failures that don't just, break the bank. Or my litmus test is pretty extreme. It's like, okay, if it doesn't lead to jail time, bankruptcy, or death, it's fair. Then you're good. And you're probably not going. It's not as risky as you think. But the thing is that we need to be able to take small risks and micro risks that build our capacity for risk. And one way to do that is to just create. And that's where we get caught up in a lot of all this other nonsense. Like, oh, how do I optimize my Instagram profile, or how do I write a perfect bio? It's like, well, you know what? You'd be better off doing just create. Like, don't worry about all that nonsense, because you'll figure all that out. That stuff is actually easy. The hard thing is doing the work.
That reminds me of something that you wrote in The Art of Being Unmistakable. You said something about, immersing yourself so deep in whatever it is that you're creating and being so present that you can't really judge your own creation, and that's where the purest work is born. And if you judge, doubt, or question it, the art gets tainted. And I can think of so many times where I go to create something for somebody or make it, a polish so that it can be on my profile, and it just sucks the life out of it.
Yeah, so it's an interesting balance, right? This is like what I call the audience of one paradox. Like, you have to, suspend judgment of the work while simultaneously knowing that it's for somebody, and that takes practice. It takes just work. Yeah, I think I probably said this to you in the writer's class. One of the things I have to always tell writers is I'm like, why are you so worried about whether it's good? You're writing in ink, not blood. This isn't going to be carved in stone somewhere. You can go back and erase it. You can delete it. And that's the beauty of the internet is like, okay, yeah, your blog post sucked. Guess what? Write another one tomorrow. Seth Godin said literally none of his 7,000 blog posts have ever gone viral. I mean, and he says most of them are average. And some of them are actually like, okay, well, Seth, this wasn't really that good.
Well, I remember in the writing workshop, you said something about and don't let me put words in your mouth, but you would write a whole bunch of stuff and you might just pull out one gem. I can't remember what you said, but you kind of said mine your writing for that treasure, right? And that gave me freedom to write a bunch of crap. And there might be one good thing in there or one idea to build upon.
Well, so Anne Lamott said that, all good writing begins with terrible first efforts. And I basically rephrased that in my non-PC way and said good writing is like shoveling a mountain of shit, in search of an ounce of gold.
Yes, that was it. That was it. Yeah. Yes.
And and I think we even have a graphic somewhere of that. We had an image of that somewhere, but it is. I mean, it's so true, right? I wrote this free ebook. I'll send it to you called Make More Art. I don't know how many people have read it, but I realized I was like, oh yeah, if your art sucks, just make more. I realized that what my only real skill was volume, particularly when it came to writing. Because like I said, I still think I'm an average writer. I'm under no illusions that I'm this extraordinary writer. I am an average writer who writes a lot, and occasionally I write something worth reading because of that.
So tell me about your writing today. What role is that playing in your life today? Is writing a tool for your actual life for you? Writing is a tool for me in my everyday life, processing, moving through. What role is it playing in your life today? And do you still use Notion?
Well, No, I don't use Notion. We'll talk about that. So,
Okay, cool.
Taj Burroughs, the surfer, said, "I surf because I'd go insane if I didn't." And I write. I was like, that's how I would describe my writing. I write because I would go insane if I didn't. It's definitely a way of processing, my thoughts, what's going on in my life. Like I said, I mean, 90% of it is useless. A lot of it is, some of it gets published, and that's what I risk sharing. And sometimes people think it's great. Sometimes people think it sucks. And that's just the nature of it, right? You go look at every best-selling book on Amazon. Every one of them has one-star reviews. And the funny thing is, you talk to any author, none of them can quote their, one-star, their five-star reviews. But I, to this day, still remember the one review about Art of Being Unmistakable that I frequently quote is from a woman who said, "I hope this guy is a better surfer than he is a writer." And I was just like, that's always stayed with me. It's like, all right, cool, whatever. Nothing that is worth creating is for everybody, and that's something I've realized. As far as Notion, no, and I'll tell you why. And this is something that has really evolved the way that I think about managing knowledge, and it even has altered my writing process a bit. So this has kind of been making its way around the web. Something called the Zettelkasten method. Stonka Ahrens, funny enough, we just published an interview with him today. Wrote a book called How to Take Smart Notes. I have no idea how I came across it, but one of the things I just saw this lecture that he gave at a software development conference, and like, this actually makes a lot of sense. So typically, for most people, and probably most of your listeners, and myself included, prior to understanding how this works, when we take book notes, what do? We highlight things that are interesting to us. If you use an app like Readwise, you copy, you basically photograph everything, or you import it using your Kindle, and then you call it a day. Now, the thing that happens is those notes are very rarely useful. So he had this line that always stayed with me in that book. He said, to think like a writer, not an archivist. And the funny thing is that our job as creatives is not to organize and to manage knowledge. It's to generate knowledge, right? So I think even the whole term personal knowledge management is nonsense. What we should be focusing on is personal knowledge generation. And so once I got a hold of that, I signed up for Nat Eliason's course, Effortless Output course on Rome. And conceptually, I loved it, but I hated the interface of Rome. I didn't quite understand how to use it. And then Mem released their tool. They, are a startup that was funded by Andreessen Horowitz. And I remember just looking at this, like, okay, wait a minute, let me see how this works. And I was like, oh my God, this is the most intuitive thing ever when it clicks. So the funny thing about the way that we organize information, the way we organize information is literally the root cause of all inefficiencies in knowledge work. So typically what we do is we organize information in hierarchical structures. And it's funny because people listening to this on a podcast, it sounds kind of like gibberish. So you have to kind of see it at work. So typically what do? We put information in folders and subfolders and files. But that's not the way your brain works. Your brain is a network, not a hierarchy. So I could rattle off one thing, Carla. If I just mentioned a city or, high school, you could probably come up with 100 different memories immediately that you know of from high school. And the funny thing is that we don't organize information in that way. And we organize it in linear structures, but the way that we think is not linear. And even the creative process is not linear. And so when I found out about Mem and then, the combination of Smart Notes, it completely transformed the way that I do this. So I'll give you the rundown of it very, quickly. So there are really 4 steps to this, and it's actually far simpler than it sounds. And at first it seems very uncomfortable because we've been conditioned to do things in a linear order our entire lives. But that makes absolutely no sense because creativity is not linear. You need, room for spontaneous insight. And when you're insistent on following a rigid structure, so for example, let's say that you're writing a blog post and you have the 5-paragraph outline and you're like, oh, I know what I want to write for section 3. But then you're like, oh, well, I have to start with section 1. Why? You don't have to start with section 1. And the person who clued me into this, and this is how I actually ended up writing Art of Being Unmistakable, was Jennifer Loudon. She told me the writing insight that to this day, and I'm pretty sure I shared this with you in the writing workshop, this I basically took to the bank. And that was that your structure has to be linear. Your process doesn't. And I was like, that is the best writing advice I've received.
Yes, I remember that.
Because then that just frees you up to just create and to write. You can always go back and put it together in some order that makes sense later. But that's one thing. So smart notes are really different because if you think back to school, right? Like school is basically all about rote memorization. And it takes us back to the beginning of our conversation where I was like, yeah, any moron can be a straight A student in high school because you just have to be disciplined and be good at memorizing things. That doesn't mean you're intelligent. But then you go to college, and I learned this the hard way in college. Like you go to a place like Berkeley, you take an economics class, you do all these problem sets, you read the textbook, you highlight all this crap in the textbook. Like if you ever buy a used textbook in college, you'll see like people have highlighted the entire textbook as if that is going to make any difference in their learning. Now, it turns out these are all horrible ways to learn. Like this, they're antithetical to actually how people learn. So with Smart Notes, what you do is you highlight and underline just as you would before. And then that's the first step. You keep a notebook by your side. And then what you do is you write in the notebook on page X, it says Y. And then what you try to do is you try to reconstruct the insight that you want to remember in your own words. And as a result, you have all these notes, and I probably have about 7,000 of them now, all rewritten in your own words that you can start to connect together. And they're like puzzle pieces. And because they're not all in folders and files and subfiles, or it's basically incredibly accessible, and you're able to make connections between ideas in ways that you wouldn't have thought to make connections before. So at first, it's really confusing to people. And part of it is that you don't have a critical mass of knowledge. So like if you look at network effects, right? So Facebook is a good example of this. Everybody here knows what Facebook is. Facebook would be useless if other friends of yours aren't on Facebook to connect with. And it's the same concept applied to knowledge management here, where you have a network effect that only kicks in after you have about 50 or so smart notes. And then you start to see this compound interest kick in where I can write, and there's a video about this that I put on the YouTube channel. I'll send it to you, where I showed how I could write a 7,000 word article in about 30 minutes. I mean, it wasn't good. Keep in mind, but the bulk of your work then actually becomes editing and organizing. You're never starting with just a blank page this way. And that's what makes this invaluable for a writer. So for me, it was just like, oh, okay, if I'm running a podcast, reading books, interviewing people, then I want access to this knowledge. I mean, you got to remember, like 1,000 interviews, 1,000 books. My brain is like an encyclopedia at this point. But when you externalize all that knowledge, you're able to take it in new directions, and you can do a lot more with it. And that is why I ditched Notion, because Notion didn't allow for this. And this is one of those things. And so that's why we called the course Maximize Your Output, because literally that's what it allows you to do. And the other thing is that it eliminates like 90% of all our productivity problems, right? Because all our productivity problems come from the fact that we have information in all these different places, right? It's like, oh, I need an image for this. Oh, it's like, I need a quote for my inbox. It's like, okay, so this puts everything right at your fingertips, so you're not context shifting constantly. So imagine being able to do this all in one app. And you're able to organize the information the way that you think. So you're not actually recalling notes, but recalling thoughts that just happen to be externalized in a note-taking app. So instead of notes in a database, they're nodes in a network, just the way information is organized in your brain. Which I realize this is like very hard to explain without visuals, but that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Yeah, it sounds fascinating. So just so I'm clear and people listening are clear, Mem is the app or the tool?
Yeah.
Mem
is the app or tool.
And then you have a course about using it. Is that right?
Yeah, it's called Maximize Your Output. So you can find it at maximizeyouroutput.com. But I also have a YouTube channel with like probably 40 tutorials on there.
I can't wait to check that out. So if you just do a search for
Mem tutorials, yeah, it's kind of funny. Like friends are one by one contacting me about this. Like, oh, you're the guy that knows this. I'm like, yeah, I guess I am.
That's awesome. So what are you putting together today? Like now, are you working on a project? Are you working on a book? Like what are you creating that you're most excited about? You're probably creating a lot of things.
Yeah, I am. So we're kind of like having a major pivot with Unmistakable Creatively. So, we've operated as a media company for a long time, but I realized, ultimately I'm a teacher at heart, and I've resisted that for a long time. And so one of the things we realized was that, you have all this sort of buzz about, the creator economy being, the next gold rush. It's not. And there are a lot of tools, a lot of distribution channels, but like how you educate people and develop the skills for this, that's a big gray area. It's kind of like all over the place. And so I realized that people often start with content and marketing and message and mission, but they don't think about the foundations that make all those things possible. So if you don't have a sustainable foundation, like good habits, good systems, then you're building a house of cards. And so for me, like, designing systems, learning to manage attention, all this stuff was a consequence of trying to build a body of work. And so what we're going to evolve into, the podcast will still be there. That's our bread and butter. But really, it's going to evolve into sort of a learning academy for the creator economy to master the process of making ideas happen. Because there is a process. And this process requires, all sorts of other skills like habits, systems, mindset, but here's the beautiful thing. If you learn this skill, you can transfer it to damn near anything. Like, I knew when I was done writing my second book, Audience of One, after about 9 months, that I was probably not going to get a third book contract and probably never will. And I kind of thought, oh, what a waste for a while. And then I realized, I was like, wait a minute, it's not a waste. The most valuable thing that comes from writing books is not the actual book, it's that you learn how to make ideas happen. And if you can make ideas happen, then you've got a gold mine at your fingertips. And so I can take an idea and bring it to life fast at a rate that makes most people uncomfortable. And I wrote an article about this because apparently this is, just in our family's DNA. Because my brother-in-law was telling me this. My dad wanted to get our front yard redone because in Southern California, landscaping is ridiculous and water bills are insane because, homeowners associations are full of pretentious idiots who basically, think that the entire neighborhood needs to look, like Buckingham Palace. And of course, because of that, water bills are really high. And my dad, being Indian, was like, this is some bullshit. I don't want to spend this much money on water every month. And so he said, you know what? He's like, I'm going to replace this with golf course grass. He had the idea at Thanksgiving, and the project was done by Christmas.
Wow.
And so my brother-in-law said, this is literally how your entire family works. He said, when I talk to you at 7:00 in the morning about something you're thinking about, by 7:00 in the evening, there's a landing page on Facebook for the idea that you just mentioned. And I mean, then it goes back to how the podcast started. Sid Zavaris sent me an email. To this day, you can find that email on Instagram. He sent me an email. An hour later, I mocked up a version of a website called Broadcast FM with no idea how to design a website. And I replied, here's a mock-up. When do you want to get started? And he said, it's funny. He said, you know what? He said, I thought I was just giving you some advice and I'd move on with my life and enter the Srini reality distortion field. And I was like, yeah, I guess I do have a pretty strong reality distortion field because I've convinced a lot of people to do a lot of things they wouldn't have otherwise.
I love that. So I want to know what's the personal edge that's next for you, like in making this pivot. And I'm really excited to see what happens with that pivot in your business too. I can't wait to check that out. Personally,
well, I think. I think for me, really the most valuable thing I have created probably is the network that I have access to. Because, instead of learning from just one person who claims to be the authority on one subject, basically I can connect people to anybody who can teach them anything. Like my joke is, if you want to rob a bank, become a porn star, run for president, I can introduce you to somebody who can teach you how. I know people who've done all those things. As I've thought about this, because I've had access to so many people, I'm like, okay, we can create a really comprehensive curriculum based on 10 years of actually making ideas happen, talking to people like the director of innovation at Google, people who are experts at, different things like Cal Newport, who was an expert at, deep work and attention management. And so when you combine all of these things together, you have sort of this learning framework. So, and it's funny because takes us to that whole idea of things emerge, not you trying to excavate them. So I just wanted to trace back. I was like, okay, if I had to go back and do this, what were the key things? I was going to put it down into 4 phases, and it was like behavior change, systems, community, and content, or voice, right? And so I kind of put this pie chart together. And I was like, okay, the problem is that people start on the right side of the pie with the content. And the problem is they don't change their behavior. And the funny thing is that is the foundation of everything. All change starts with changing behavior. And that is because, we may have done this in writing class, because I remember even in the audience class, I didn't tell anything for 4 weeks. I didn't teach anybody anything about building an audience. And I told them, I was like, just trust the process here. I promise you we will get to all that stuff. But I am preparing you in a way that will make this sustainable. It's kind of like the Mr. Miyagi thing. It's like you have to wax the cars, sand the floors, and paint the fence before you can step in the ring and, fight in a karate tournament.
That's right.
And people don't want to do that because it's not sexy.
But it's what makes it sustainable, right? I know that in the work I do, the mindset work I do, it is the foundation to anything you want to create or change in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because the thing is that, you stop relying on bullshit like inspiration and, scented candles and, lighting and burning incense or burning sage. I tend to pick on New Age people a lot, which you probably know from having listened to the podcast. And my old roommate, Matt, he's like, you realize your own guests would qualify as spouting New Age bullshit. I was like, yes, but I try to, hold their feet to the fire.
Love that.
But yeah, that's what I would say. I mean, it really is a combination of the things. So that's one big part of this. And that literally just came about last week after talking to our investor. We're like, are we really going to be able to get to hundreds of millions of listeners? Probably not. And we want to be realistic. And then the other thing is we have more control over this than we would, being entirely funded by advertisers.
Yeah. So what I want to know, like, where is your heart inspired the most right now? Is it that?
Well, this is exciting to me because I'll tell you, it's funny in a lot of ways. It comes full circle to the start of Unmistakable Creative, because when Greg and I started working together, my old mentor, Greg Hartle, one of the things I told him was that, startups have Y Combinators, Techstars, all these different incubators. Creatives have nothing. Creatives have to basically throw spaghetti against the wall to see what sticks. And there's no sort of ecosystem that allows for incubation of creative projects with guidance from people who are experienced, who actually know what it takes to make ideas happen, to test ideas, to validate them, to learn all these foundational things. Because even if you take like a typical sort of online course, like a blogging course or copywriting course, right? None of those things will work if you don't have these foundations. So like I took Ramit's Sethi's copywriting course, and it was like a $2,000 course. I'm like, you better damn well believe I'm going to get my money back. I'm Indian. Like, for me, that matters. And so I did every single lesson. I made my money back probably 20 times over on what I spent on that course. But the reason for that is that I had a lot of the foundations already. So it was easy for me. I knew how to organize projects. I knew how to execute fast. I knew how to manage my time. I knew how to finish the things that I started. Very mundane, not so sexy skills, but all the things that, I guess now, see, this is why I like talking to people like you, because now I have it. It's like the things that aren't sexy are what make your work sustainable.
Yeah, it's so true. So true. So I love how that goes full circle back to the Art of Being Unmistakable, because it sounds like this is like a vehicle for creatives and who are taking that same journey, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, I never liked the idea, and I think I wrote about this in Art of Being Unmistakable, that we give anybody a map, right? Because everybody's different. And so I'm very clear on the fact that, some of what I say is nonsense, and it might be, and so I try to, like explain things in frameworks and tell people modify this as you see fit. Because then you will get something far more valuable from it, like tailor it to your natural strengths. So Unmistakable Creative started because I was taking a course about how to start a blog, not start a podcast. It was one lesson in that course was to start a podcast. It was to interview somebody. And I started a weekly series. So one minor deviation in somebody's instructions can literally transform your results in ways you don't expect. Mm-hmm. So the way I'd sum that up is you should never follow anybody's advice to the letter.
Okay, so this is a perfect segue to complete, but I want to read something from your from that book, The Art of Being Unmistakable. Srini writes, if I were to use a map long enough, eventually I would become fearful of ditching it for a compass. However, if I want to do interesting work, take risks, and see what I am really made of, I have to be willing to use a compass instead of a map. The day I ditched the map for the compass is the day I walked off the edge of the earth, and my work became an experience that only I can create for people. Every time I've been given a map, I've gotten lost. The map was based on where somebody else wanted me to end up. By following that map, at best, I will become a pale imitation of the person who drew the map. And I will tell you that compass versus map has been a source of inspiration in my creativity since I read your book. And so I want to just thank you. But before I do that, I want you to share where people can find more out about you and all the incredible stuff you're up to.
Yeah, I'll tell you what. I will create just a bonus page for your listeners. I don't know the URL off the top of my head, but for the podcast, it's just Unmistakable Creative. You can find it anywhere where you listen to podcasts. All my books are on Amazon or wherever you buy books. And then, unmistakablecreative.com is where you can kind of experience the unmistakable universe.
Perfect. And we'll put all of that in the show notes and whatever you send over. And I just want to personally thank you for making the time to be here. When I thought of reaching out to you, it was like that 20 seconds of courage. I do a lot of things with 20 seconds of courage. And I'm like, I'm just going to reach out and ask. All he can say is no. And I was so delightfully surprised when you replied quickly and said that you'd be willing to be here. So it means a lot to me that you're here. Thank you for being a huge inspiration in my creative journey and entrepreneurial life. And yeah, thanks for hanging out.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been really fun.
Awesome.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Differently. I hope it stirred your thinking, and I invite you to take one inspired action from something that stood out to you. If you want to hear more conversations like this, hit follow on your favorite podcast app. And if this episode could impact someone you know, please pass it along. Remember, new episodes drop weekly. See you next week.